Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the release of this year's State of the Nation's Housing Report. Our center has been releasing this report annually for more than 30 years, so it's chronicled a number of unusual and challenging times, but perhaps none more so than this past year. We hope the information provided by the report helps inform the response needed from the worlds of policy, industry, and advocacy to address the significant housing challenges we face as a country. Before we get started, I want to thank our Policy Advisory Board, Wells Fargo, and other sponsors of this year's report for supporting our research. I also want to thank the hardworking staff at the center who put in tremendous effort to produce 2 of these reports in just 7 months. And I also want to give a special thank you to Marcia Fernald, who has edited every single one of those reports since the first year, and John Skirchak, our designer, who's been doing it for now going on 20 years. I do want to point out there is closed captioning available. You can click on the bottom of your screen on live transcript to turn that on. Some of you may see it under more and turn on show subtitles. So with that, let's kick it off with a presentation of key findings from the report from my colleague, Dan McHugh, a senior research associate at the center, one of the lead authors of the report for the past 15 years. After Dan's presentation, we'll welcome our panel to discuss the implications of this year's findings for housing in the U.S. So let me turn it over to you, Dan.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. I hope you can see my screen. Good. Well, the story of this year's State of the Nation's Housing Report begins with the for sale housing markets, which are currently red hot. Over the past year, a surge in home buyer demand started in about mid-2020 sent home prices racing upwards as the number of homes for sale dropped to historic lows. In this chart, we see the rate of home price appreciation, shown in yellow, jumped from about 4.5% in March of 2020 to 10% in December, the first double-digit rise in home prices since 2014. And prices kept going upward in 2021, currently up 13% year over year in March. And this is the national average. Many markets described in the report are seeing even higher rates of appreciation, rates that top 20% in places like Boise and Austin, Tacoma, Washington. Prices are being bid up as buyers compete for historically low supply of available homes for sale. Markets are tight. The inventory of homes for sale, shown here in blue, dipped below 2 months in late 2020 for the first time on record. In context, 6 months of supply has historically been the indicator of a balanced market, but we haven't been at that level for a decade. Meanwhile, in rental housing, vacancy rates shown in this chart describe a tale of 2 markets, basically. On one side, there's the extreme weakness for rentals in prime urban areas. Vacancy rates shown here in the blue rising above the other lines in 2020. These are the largely high-end units in the densest, most expensive city neighborhoods. When the pandemic hit, vacancy rates for these apartments rose from about 7% in early 2020 to 10% by the end of the year. At the same time, suburban rental markets saw continued tightening throughout 2020, vacancy rates actually falling throughout the year, reflecting a general shift in housing demand towards more suburban areas over the past year. But the story's not over for urban rental markets. We can also see in this chart some recovery in prime urban vacancy rates starting in early 2021. It's likely to continue as more urban amenities, businesses, and offices reopen and higher levels of demand for these apartments return. Until then, renters in high-cost cities like New York, San Francisco, big markets are taking advantage of some significant rent reductions in high-end units, upwards of 15 to 20% declines in rents year over year in some areas. But as markets recover, the data shows significant amounts of financial stress remains among households. And the levels of financial distress are uneven across households, being disproportionately felt by renters and people of color. In this chart, we see how still 17% of all renter households report being behind on rent in early 2021. Shares rise to 21% for Hispanic renters and fully 29% of Black renter households reporting being behind on rent payments, nearly 3 times the 11% share reported among white renters. in total, getting these roughly 7 million households who are behind on rent, caught up on housing payments before eviction moratoriums expire will be a growing concern in the coming months. But it's not just renters. We see here also the measurable levels of distress in housing remain among homeowners as well. 9% of all homeowners reporting being behind on mortgage payments in early 2021, rising to over 16% of Black, Hispanic, and Asian homeowners. Again, double the 7% share among white homeowners behind on housing payments. Racial disparities also exist among the 2.3 million homeowners with mortgages currently in forbearance in early 2021, who will be at risk of foreclosure when forbearance periods expire in the coming months. Financial distress during the pandemic also disproportionately affected low-income households, most of whom entered the pandemic already burdened by high housing costs. Here we see how in 2019, just before the pandemic began, high shares of households with low and moderate incomes were already burdened by high housing costs that exceeded 30% and even 50% of their incomes. Low and moderate income renters were burdened at the highest rates. Cost burdens affected fully 82% of renter households with incomes below $25,000 a year. This is a total of 11 million low-income renter households cost burdened, 8 million of whom were severely burdened, spending more than half their incomes on housing costs. We see here also burdens face 70% of owners earning less than $25,000 per year too, another 6 million households with burdens. As we've seen over the past year, dedicating so much income to housing affects the ability of millions of cost-burdened households to build the savings needed to weather a financial storm, and left millions of households in a position where even a minor loss of income could put them at risk of losing their homes. The report concludes by discussing how, in order to make meaningful improvements to housing affordability and address the many challenges worsened by the pandemic, policymakers at all levels of government must work together to reduce barriers to producing modestly priced homes in a range of communities. Also reduce the many persistent racial and ethnic disparities in housing cost burdens, home ownership, and household wealth that were reinforced by the pandemic. We must also expand rental assistance and other efforts that have proven to be so important over the past year in keeping economically vulnerable households affordably and stably housed. Now, with that brief introduction to the report, let me turn it over to Tracy Jan from the Washington Post to introduce our panel.
Thank you so much, Dan. You are giving me PTSD from my own pandemic-induced suburban housing hunt this last year. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are on the center's website, and each of you is welcome to turn on your cameras as well. First, joining us again is Chris Herbert, Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies. Also joining us is Erica Potig, Special Assistant to President Biden for Housing and Urban Policy. Clarence Anthony is CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities. And finally, with us today is Gary Acosta, co-founder and CEO of the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Thanks all of you for being here today. And those watching on Zoom can join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag Harvard Housing Report. We may even take a few of your Twitter questions later in the hour. I'm going to start with you, Chris. Obviously, the big headline this year is off the charts home sales. Record prices, bidding wars. Just a minute here, sorry. Record prices, bidding wars, very little inventory, and record low interest rates have combined to make things, in the words of some, a bit bonkers lately. What's going on and how do we get here? Are we in, dare I say, the B word, a bubble?
Well, I don't think we're in a bubble. And even though the price rise that we're seeing now looks reminiscent of what was happening in the mid-2000s, the circumstances are so different. In the early 2000s, what we had was a situation where housing supply was going bonkers itself. We were building 2 million homes a year, well outpacing demand. But we had very easy access to credit, too easy access to credit, credit that was really unreasonably being extended. And we had prices going up and people betting on those prices. So we had very speculative behavior, people buying homes with no intention to occupy them. Very different than what we have today. Today, we had a period of time where we've been undersupplied in housing for a long period of time. And demand has been growing, but it hasn't been that strong. But you take that tight supply In fact, when it has been a tight credit market and you really goose demand, which is what happened when the millennial generation who've been putting off buying homes hit the pandemic, hit that stage of life when they're looking to buy homes and flooded into the market. For all those who had kept their jobs and were not spending money elsewhere, had really a lot of money to spend on housing, throw in low interest rates, and you get that cocktail that has resulted in strong demand, tight supply, and housing prices going way up. I don't see a formula where that turns around in the sense that it's going to take a while for supply to catch up. Interest rates are likely to stay fairly low for a while, and demand is likely to stay strong. So those house prices, as much as I think they will moderate, but I think they'll moderate in part because there will be a supply response, because interest rates will go up, because we're going to get to a point where affordability is really strained. But I think we are looking at a point where we're going to be living with a very unaffordable market. Price to income ratios now are nationally at 4.4. They were typically below 3 or around 3 before the housing bubble. Now we have a quarter of states, a quarter of large metro areas where that ratio is above 5. And in those places, you have to have a significant income and significant savings to get into home ownership. And so what I worry about is we've got prices at a level now which is really going to price a lot of people out of the market, and particularly people of color who don't have a family history of home ownership and don't have that wealth to draw on.
That's right. Erica, despite all of this home buying by the people who didn't face financial hardship during the pandemic, there are still millions of people, millions of Americans who lost income over the last year, who are behind on their housing payments and are at risk of eviction or foreclosure. How does President Biden's plan help these at-risk households?
Thank you, Tracy. And just also thank you. I admire all the work that you do. And Chris, thank you. This is one of my required readings. Every year it comes out. So I'm thrilled to be a part of the panel here today talking about it. So very much appreciate the pain, the economic pain, the pain of the loss that we have all experienced over the last year that has been disproportionately felt, of course, on communities of color. But I also think that it's important to acknowledge just how far we have come. Since President Biden took office, more than 160 million Americans have received at least one dose of the vaccine, representing 64% of all adult Americans. And I think it's also important to acknowledge, and I think some of what Chris just presented, is that our economy is rebounding. We have added an average of 500,000 jobs per month, and the US GDP is expected to grow 6.8% this year alone. And this is good news, and we can't just let up. So I want to also acknowledge that we have taken steps to protect those that have felt that disproportionate pain that the pandemic has created for both the public health risk and for the economy. So we know that the eviction moratorium has been an important part of that strategy, and it has most definitely saved lives. And one of the first actions that the president took was to extend it first until the end of March, and then again until the end of June. And alongside that extension of the eviction moratorium, we worked with HUD and the CFPB and FTC to also strengthen the enforcement so that it can be the backstop to evictions that it plays. And then also for foreclosures, there are an important set of policies put into place through the CARES Act that the President Biden extended the foreclosure moratoria through the end of June and extended the mortgage forbearance, offering people more opportunity to take advantage of the mortgage forbearance. And now we are at a place where we're thinking about the next stage of relief for those borrowers as well as they come out of mortgage forbearance later this year. And we're actively at work with all the agencies in developing policies that will provide the just over 2 million households that are in mortgage forbearance at this time. So those are some of the executive actions we've taken, but the administration has also worked with Congress at on historic investments as well that are critically important to vulnerable tenants and landlords. So of course, the American Rescue Plan adds over $21 billion onto the $25 billion appropriated through the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And we have continued to update guidance to make sure that cities, states, counties, and tribes can execute well, because now it is that they are on the front lines of making this assistance available to tenants and landlords as they seek assistance and also to protect from evictions when the moratorium eventually lifts. But the American Rescue Plan also provided $10 billion for foreclosure, for mortgage relief to prevent foreclosures. We know that 70% of borrowers receive a government-backed or guaranteed loan, but 30% are in the private market. The $10 billion will help both those who have private mortgages who are in mortgage forbearance, as well as complement other strategies that the agencies will provide for those mortgages. But on top of all of that, there's also $350 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds. And housing, I'm here to say housing and other economic stabilization programs are an eligible use. And we certainly hope that they do get used in those ways.
Thank you, Erica. Clarence, the pandemic made clear the direct connections between economic stability, housing stability, race, and an individual's well-being overall. Erica talked about what the federal government plans to do and has already done, but what steps can cities take to help shore up their communities and keep families in their homes, both now and in the long term?
Well, first of all, Tracy, thank you for inviting me here today. And I must tell you, I was like you listening to that report that Dan shared, and then Chris's input really brought home the challenge that we all have in our nation, and how important this report is to our nation in regards to just framing the problem that we have and the challenge that we have. And it does, and it will take the federal government as a partner, as Erica has already noted. Our local municipal leaders are creating amazing programs and infrastructure to assist their residents. And one example is San Antonio. San Antonio has created a emergency housing assistance program. And the program before COVID-19 got about 50 applications per week. And after COVID-19, the first week after the relaunching of the program, the city received 5,300 applications, like a 10,000% increase. And it was $25 million, and it was direct cash assistance to low-income residents who were experiencing job or health-related hardships. And that's just one example of what municipal leaders know that they have to do. No matter what size, your city, town, and village, you have to be able to come up with these types of initiatives in partnership with our federal government, the Biden administration, as well as the state government. The other thing is there's that recognition that the report also outlines, that people of color have been hurt significantly 4 times the rate of white Americans. And what that says to us as municipal leaders, and my mayors and council members have acknowledged that, is that COVID-19 made us stop for a minute and really pay attention to the facts and to the data. And that data is helping us to use the American Rescue dollars in a more targeted, strategic, and outcome-oriented manner. And so the National League of Cities is really promoting a more systems approach, Erica, to utilizing these dollars so that in a year and a half, this report that talks about, I would say, the state of the nation's housing in 2022 will actually show that we are addressing the most low income folks in our community, the Black and brown in our community, those that were impacted most. So it's a big job, but city leaders, whether it's Pittsburgh with their eviction mediation and diversion program, whether it's Kansas City, Missouri, who's providing attorneys to be able to help in legal assistance to low-income tenants facing evictions. we have to be creative, we have to be responsive, and we must have a partner in the federal and state government, as well as community-based organizations. But this is a tough time, y'all. And I'm so glad that this report is highlighting the challenge that we have, because only if we acknowledge that we have this challenge will we come together and address it. And this is our time to do that.
Thank you, Clarence. I wanted to follow up with you and Erica about the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars in housing aid, in government housing aid, are still unspent despite this huge need. I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts. My colleagues at the Post have covered this issue in Washington and elsewhere. Do you want to go first, Erica?
Happy to, Tracy. So yes, and we are doing everything we can using every tool in our toolbox and more. Some of those have already been shared and some will be forthcoming to make it even easier for states, counties, and cities and tribes to make sure that money reaches tenants and landlords. And so some of that guidance came out on May 7th. And to, I think, a lot of accolades by both tenant advocates and landlords and grantees of the program. And we hope that that creates more flexibilities. But we continue to listen to tenants and landlords and Treasury's grantees to take other steps to ensure that those resources are as flexible as possible. But the challenge does now rest at the local level for getting those resources in the hands of tenants and landlords.
Right. Clarence, do you have any thoughts on how to streamline the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we're going to spend that money. So let's be very clear. Our municipal leaders will do it in a strategic and responsible way. And in order to do that, a lot of the communities were not prepared with the infrastructure to be able to respond day one when the dollars started to come. So what we're seeing is they're developing plans to be able to outline, are they going to develop a housing assistance program, the eviction programs? Are they going to purchase hotels or motels to house the homeless? So our leaders are putting plans together, and we will have mortgage assistance programs and other initiatives stood up, and I would say in the next 3 to 4 months. The ARP money is there until 2024. And we also, cities under 50,000, we're waiting for those dollars. Some of them are waiting for the state to release the dollars. So it's not just municipal leaders not spending it, it's some have not gotten it yet, and we're waiting. And once we do, our leaders will spend it in a strategic and focused and outcome-oriented manner.
Thank you. Thank you. Gary, according to the report, the Black-white homeownership gap stood at 28.1 percentage points last year, and the Hispanic white homeownership gap was not far behind at 23.8 percentage points. The homeownership gap, especially for Black Americans, has not budged for more than 5 decades and directly correlates to the racial wealth gap, in which white families have 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Hispanic family. What can be done to narrow these disparities?
Well, thanks, Tracy. Let me first say that this issue is not just an issue that affects African Americans or Black families and Latino families. It's an issue that affects the overall market. The Harvard report has said in past years that they expect 70 to 80% of new home buyers in the coming decade to be minority or immigrant. So this is going to have a big impact on the overall marketplace at some point. I think the go-to answer to your question is better access to mortgage credit and down payment assistance, especially because of the wealth gap. Down payment assistance is an important tool. And then secondly, access to credit has never been tougher right now, especially for self-employed borrowers. And I will tell you that 1 in 3 Latino families in the country own a small business. So that's an issue that needs to be solved. But I'm going to focus on three other issues that are maybe less obvious, but I think could have as much or more an impact on improving homeownership access for both communities. So number one, if I had a silver bullet or a magic wand, and I could only do one thing that I would think would have the biggest impact on improving homeownership for Latinos and African Americans, it would be to better diversify the housing, real estate, and mortgage markets. I would double the number of Latinos and African Americans in the industry overnight. And the reason is that this is still a very complicated process, something that most families won't do more than once or twice in a lifetime if they're lucky. So they need somebody who can help them navigate through the process. And if they have somebody who they know, who they trust, who understands them, understands their community, and maybe could even speak the language that they prefer to speak, that could be a game changer. So that's number one. Number two, without question, is we've got to address the inventory issue in the country. We can qualify 10 million new Latinos and African American families, and it won't make that much of a difference if they don't have homes to purchase. So we have to improve inventory in this country. And then thirdly, and maybe this is a bit of an outlier, but I believe strongly in this, and that is we have to provide more support for Black and Latino entrepreneurs in the housing industry. And I'll tell you why. Not only is that going to be the right thing to do for them, it's also going to have an impact on the way the larger corporations that serve the industry behave. And I'm going to end with one small anecdote. I used to be on the Mortgage Bankers Association board of directors, and I had some colleagues who owned mortgage companies. And I had a friend who owned a fairly large mortgage company in the Midwest. And he told me one time, I'm really going to focus on diversity this year. I was looking at our staff and we're just, we're not as diverse as we need to be. And because he was a friend, I was very, very honest with him. I said, you're not going to do that. I said, you're not going to do that because that's just going to take too much time and too much effort. And there's not enough in it for you to do that. However, when somebody comes into your marketplace and takes 20% share from you because they have a diverse staff and they are grabbing more of that business, then you're going to have a war room meeting in your office to address that issue overnight. It's not going to be a nice to have, it's going to be a must have at that point. So I believe strongly in supporting Latino and African American small businesses. There's a lot of them out there, but we need to help them get to scale. Those three things, I believe, and I've seen it happen in the Latino marketplace in particular, because Latinos, even though there is still a big gap, have had 6 straight years of homeownership growth, and things are trending in a better direction right now. So anyways, that's the things that I would do for sure.
And Tracy, I think that's a great list that Gary put out there. I might put a plug in too for support for homeowner education and counseling. And a lot of immigrant communities and first generation home buyers haven't navigated this process. Real estate agencies are an important source of information and advice, as are mortgage lenders. But I think having that other party as part of that process, one of the reasons why people have trouble accessing credit is the need to have savings, they need to get their credit in order. They also need to understand the process and what they can afford. Homeownership education and counseling can be really important in helping to prepare people. And what we need to do is modernize it too. Historically, it's been delivered face-to-face in retail centers, but there's a whole host of ways now to get that information in the place in a way that people need. And so I would just put a plug in for that as another piece of the ecosystem that needs to be developed to help provide those supports.
No, I would agree with that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Chris, continuing with you, another striking fact from the report is that the percentage of their income that people are paying for housing, which has long been a struggle for low-income Americans, is actually rising for middle-class families. Even before the pandemic, 70% of renters earning between $25,000 and $75,000 a year were considered cost-burdened, meaning that they spent more than 30% of their income on housing. And this one really struck me, nearly 50% of renters who earn between $35,000 and $50,000 a year were cost-burdened. What does this mean, and how do we address this?
Tracy, that really has been a fundamental trend that's been happening since the start of this century, really. And what it really reflects is, housing affordability is a function of what's your income and what is housing cost. And it's just a sign that housing costs have been outpacing incomes, not just for people at the bottom of the income distribution, but people who are working at decent full-time jobs. And so it really points to the fact that we need to do something to bend the housing cost curve. particularly for people who are making more moderate incomes who are beyond the reach of housing subsidy programs. So that really points to what can we do to provide ability to expand the supply of modest cost housing. And that gets us to talking about zoning reform, allowing for higher density, smaller housing. It gets to support for more means of offsite production and other ways of bringing down the cost of producing housing. But I don't want to lose in this conversation, as important as that trend is, and as much as that's democratizing this problem of housing affordability, the fact that the biggest problem is still heavily concentrated among the poorest households. If you look at people making less than $25,000 a year, mind you, making $25,000 a year, you're still working full-time, year-round at well more than the federal minimum wage. That group is 80% cost burden, mostly spending more than 50% of their income on housing. In fact, of the 10.5 million renters spending more than 50% of their income on housing, more than 8 million of them are in that lowest income group. So we need to have, I think, more private market solutions for that middle sector of the market to produce affordable housing, but we still need to do something with federal supports or government supports for people at the bottom of the market.
That's right. And speaking of those folks, Erica, obviously, as you discussed, the president has a plan to help renters who are struggling right now because of the pandemic. But what are the administration's plans to support those renters who were struggling even before COVID, the lowest income renters we were just discussing, for whom it just gets harder each year?
Thank you. And this is such an important question. And Chris, I think, illustrated it perfectly, which is we had 10.5 million renters before the crisis who are paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And that housing instability also is a group of people that can fall in and out of homelessness. So I want to highlight first a set of policies and programs that were funded in ARP to really address homelessness, both through emergency housing vouchers that were about 70,000 additional vouchers to help people gain and sustain longer term solutions to housing stability, but principally for those very vulnerable renters or people who have struggled in that cycle, but also $5 billion in funds to create more permanent housing solutions. And so one of the things that happened in the pandemic is we used hotels and motels that weren't getting utilized during the pandemic to house those people experiencing homelessness. Well, now as things have shifted, some of them have become available, and California had a big program to purchase those as more permanent solutions. So there's $5 billion additional in funds to help create some of those permanent solutions. But to get to Chris's other point about housing supply, the American Jobs Plan has over $300 billion in investments in both grants and in tax credits to increase the housing supply. Because we do think that this is one of the most important challenges that we need to address, because it creates the housing affordability challenges across the spectrum that Chris described. The investments that we're calling for would double the low-income housing tax credit, pair $100 billion in federal subsidies to help close the gaps, to support the acceleration of the construction and rehabilitation of more than 1 million affordable rental housing units. Includes a historic investment in public housing rehabilitation as well as part of that plan. And we think that is just critical to, again, sort of release the valve on housing affordability across the spectrum. Chris also mentioned zoning. We think that trying to incentivize local zoning levers to be more favorable to multifamily housing development is also part of the solution. And so there's a $5 billion investment that would create those kinds of incentives to communities that are in many cases sort of stepping up and trying to move this along, but would probably benefit from some additional flexible funding that would reward that policy change. And so we have contemplated that investment as being able to do that. But the last policy that I really want to highlight is the president has committed to expanding rental assistance to all eligible households, and the down payment on that is in the budget with an addition of 200,000 additional vouchers to serve an additional 200,000 households, because that will be the safety net that we need. So the next time next 100 years that we face a crisis like we just had, we don't need emergency rental assistance. We'll have the safety net that can catch people as they're falling in and out of crises.
Thank you. Chris, going back to home ownership for a minute, although of course we need to narrow the racial home ownership gap, doing so at a time when supply is so tight has implications as well. How do you help move more people into home ownership when there just aren't that many homes available for people to buy?
Yeah, Tracy, that's a really good question. I think that what we don't want to do is flood the market with demand side subsidies at a time when supply is so tight. But I think that does lead us to the question, and Gary mentioned this, is that we need to do things to expand the supply. And part of it will be expanding the supply again through the private sector. We need modest price entry-level housing. And that's going to require, zoning reform and other things. I think the president's infrastructure plan included funding for 500,000 homes to be rehabbed or built in essentially distressed communities. And this is, an important way to expand supply in, many areas that are predominantly people of color that would provide, both neighborhood revitalization impacts and an opportunity to buy a home. And by expanding supply, help to alleviate those price pressures. But we're not going to be able to get there, meaning close those racial gaps in home ownership solely through supply side programs. And so I think, and Gary also mentioned down payment assistance as a key part. I think we just have to be thoughtful about how we structure those programs and how they're targeted. If we made it broadly available to everyone, we're going to be throwing gas on a fire in many respects. So thinking about how do we target those programs so that the folks that we want to help close those gaps. There's been some proposals about home ownership programs aimed at first generation home buyers. I think that's a really effective way to think about how do we close gaps for people who haven't had an opportunity in their family history to buy homes. It would target those in a way that would help minimize those inflationary impacts on the market. Gary may have other ideas on this too.
Well, there's I think there's basic mathematics that make that issue very challenging. And I do think that trying to solve the issue around zoning issues is one thing that could help open up things in terms of, more development of homes, especially affordable homes, both now and in the future. It is going to take a big effort and a great deal of coordination between federal, state, and local governments to solve that problem. But I think, first of all, we have to recognize that it is a problem, and it's a problem that's not going to go away.
Thank you, Gary. Clarence, homelessness remains prevalent nationwide, but many states and cities responded quickly to stem the spread of COVID-19 among people experiencing homelessness by converting hotels and motels into shelters, as we discussed. The federal policy response has freed up significant funding for these purposes as well. Of these approaches, are there any that you think should remain post-pandemic? And what has worked well, and where do we go from here?
Tracy, thanks for that question. I'm gonna take a moment to answer a little bit on that other question, because it's really important to me personally and to our members. And if we were in person, I'd go and give Gary a high five and all of the comments that he made about getting people of color in the industry, because Blacks and Hispanics do buy homes. And I can tell you personally, if a real estate company does not have a diverse work team, whether it's women, Blacks, Asian Pacific, women, everyone, I wouldn't use them. And that's what I'm encouraging the industry to recognize, that, you'll get resolutions to some of these issues if you, in fact, have people of color around the table. And so as we look at the racial disparities, we first got to know what they are. And every community needs to do a racial impact study that will determine the effects of their policies and land use policies on communities of color. So if you are moving people out and you're creating a gentrified community, and you say you can come back, but all of the apartments are 1 and 2 bedrooms, that's not for a family. That's for a startup community, and it has happened in Washington, D.C. and all over America. but we always say that we're creating affordable housing, but not for those that are there now or those that want to return. And I also think about implementing race-specific anti-displacement policies. We gotta figure out the implications of these policies and not continue to fund and create initiatives that don't address the disparities that exist. Let's get the study, let's look at the data, let's look at the gaps, and then let's create a trusted program that will in fact create a stock of housing that is inclusive of all folks that live in that community. And clearly the homeless issue has the same type of disparity. And I think that there are approaches that must stay in post-pandemic that have worked. Making racial equity a priority in the response to end homelessness. I continue to hit that because it is important. That means ensuring homeless programs and systems don't have a disparate impact on individuals based upon race and ethnicity. I also think that we need to keep and institutionalize the emergency rental assistance programs to ensure funding is available to house individuals and homeowners who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. And these types of initiatives that work now, they should continue to work. My second job out of college was working for Housing and Community Development Department in Palm Beach County. And it was one of the smallest offices. And that just showed us something. We have to increase staffing as cities, as well as nationally, to make sure that we are studying, getting the data, focusing, and making sure that finally we're leveraging partnerships with nonprofits and grassroots organizations. Now, I got to tell you, you can probably hear the passion that is in my voice, because I know how important it is to be able to create homes so that people can feel that wherever they live, they call that place home, because they do in fact have a roof over their heads and a place for their family to lay. So both of those are very important and they're intertwined. And again, I'm so happy that this report is lifting up the challenges that we have, and our city leaders are ready to address them. So thank you, Tracy.
No, thank you, Clarence. I heard a plug for the affirmatively furthering fair housing process in your encouragement to analyze the racial impacts of zoning and other policy implications.
Yes.
Gary, the halt in immigration in April 2020 pulled down overall population growth in the United States. This is significant because low immigration levels translate directly into slower household growth and therefore into weaker housing demand. What do you think are the implications of this going forward, and how do we course correct here?
Well, first of all, I think that immigration as an issue, it's unfortunate that it's become so politicized because it is as much an economic issue as it is anything else. Yes, it'll afford demand in the long run because growth rates in terms of our population and household formations has been slowing for a while, and immigration is where we're going to get growth and where we're going to get increases to our labor force. But also it affects the supply side. If you know who works in the construction industry, about 35% of that industry depends on both Latino and immigrant populations. About 50% of that Latino populations are immigrants. So this is an issue that affects both supply and demand in our industry, and something that needs to be prioritized, and something, frankly, I don't understand why the industry itself doesn't rally around more collectively. NARP has prioritized immigration for a long time as being one of our pillar issues, and it would be great to see other organizations in our industry prioritize it as well, because it's going to have a major impact, if not now, certainly in the near future.
Tracy, I might just add to that. One of the findings in the report this year that I think buried in the fact that the market is so hot right now is this red light that's flashing on the dashboard about the long run household growth levels that we're looking at. Immigration is 30 to 40% of household growth in any given year. But the rest of it obviously is a function of births and deaths and how much is the population growing naturally as opposed to from immigration. We last year saw the lowest level of population growth in this country in a century. And that was because immigration had fallen down, but also because births were way down and deaths were way up. And not just because of COVID, but because of also the opioid crisis. And so if we look at that, the fact that the population is growing so slowly, as we look out 10 years from now, as the baby boom generation ages and starts to decline, shall we say, we're going to see a significant slowdown in household growth. The Joint Center has been forecasting about 1.2, 1.3 million households a year. Right now, we're running at 1.5, which reflects the kind of pent-up demand of millennials who were slow to get out. But about 5-10 years from now, that number is going to be 1 million or less. And that's a lot less household, a lot less housing demand. And so in some respects, that'll help cool the housing market. But if you think about who the winners and losers are nationally, there's going to be a lot of markets where there's an older population, the demand is declining, and we're going to see a lot of really weak housing markets, people who are counting on that nest egg. So I think we have to think about policies that support families, policies that address the opioids, and policies that deal with immigration as housing policy as well.
Right. Thank you for that. Erica, we spoke earlier about homeownership gaps. Racial gaps also exist in who's able to take advantage of the low interest rates to refinance. Even before interest rates dropped to historic lows, only a quarter of Hispanic and Asian homeowners and a fifth of Black homeowners refinanced their mortgages in 2019, compared to a third of white homeowners. Research has suggested this may be due to high denial rates for households of color and limited cash to cover the closing costs. President Biden also mentioned in Tulsa recently that Black-owned homes are often appraised at a lower value than similar homes owned by white families, something many Black families discovered when they tried to refinance. What is the administration doing to address that?
Thank you for that question. And I want to reflect on the larger goals of also to start with a reflection on the larger goals that the president laid out in a memorandum in the first week in office that acknowledged our nation's history of discrimination in housing policy and practices. And that memorandum also was laid the course for the review that HUD did of its disparate impact and affirmatively furthering for housing policies. And he really directs HUD in that respect to take all the necessary steps to advance the law's requirements and to affirmatively further for housing. So I think in that context, and recognizing that fair housing is a much broader framework for the kinds of actions that HUD can take, when the president went to Tulsa to commemorate the Tulsa Race Massacre, he announced the administration would take action to address racial discrimination in the housing market, including launching the first of its kind interagency effort to address inequity in home appraisals and conducting rulemaking to aggressively combat housing discrimination. Now, I think we are just at the start of this process, but are looking at the number of levers that the administration has at its disposal to address racial bias in home appraisals, including legal enforcement, regulation, training, and guidance. And we expect Secretary Fudge and also Ambassador Rice, who will join her in that effort, will work across agencies to identify kind of the full range of levers available. It is not a day goes by, and maybe I'm just sort of viscerally hit by these articles in the story of the news that tells the story of Black or brown homeowners that have faced this issue with appraisals. So it makes a lot of sense, but I would say one of the things I've learned in studying this issue is the point that Gary made about how white the appraisal industry is, and that sort of one of the challenges and one of the opportunities we have is also to create a more diverse workforce, so that we're not only sort of training folks on racial bias who are already in the industry, but hopefully creating pipelines for others to join that industry as well.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, those stories are incredible all around the country of appraisers going in and undervaluing homes owned by people of color. It's incredible. Clarence, my colleague Rachel Siegel, who covers the Federal Reserve, wrote an excellent piece recently about the unintended side effect of Fed policy, inflating the housing market and exacerbating housing inequality in unexpected places like Kingston, New York, where the average home value in the country rose 30% during the pandemic, and renters are being pushed out as homeowners are motivated to sell their properties. What types of policies do you think should be considered to address rapid gentrification?
Yeah, I sort of started talking about that a little bit earlier, Tracy, because I do think it's important that we discuss it today and as Americans. I do think, again, the racial impact study is important, making sure that we know how our policies and programs, what impact they're having on communities of color. I think we have to increase our affordable housing production in America. And while we do that, we have to do it in a strategic way, embedding, institutionalizing racial equity in every one of those developments. I also think there are other equitable development methods that should be considered that creates transparency, community involvement, community ownership, and community planning. Because then from that, you'll get the community saying that this is my housing community, and I actually, again, lived here. Funding equitable housing development, putting it in your budget, making sure that funding for those housing projects and communities, I'd say, actually are equal to other commitments that you have in your budget. And making sure that we, I guess, combine or parlay the federal, state, and local and philanthropic dollars in a way that we create long-term, not short-term, but long-term equitable housing solutions. So those are a few things, but it has to start with knowing what we have to deal with. It needs to start with implementing inclusionary housing policies as well. And again, investing in shared equitable housing models that creates land trust, creates commitments from the public and private and nonprofit community. Because our nation historically did not have these type of systems and planning processes in place. And I think that housing has been one of the most important investment that any American can make that creates wealth and creates an opportunity for residents to be able to feel again like this is the place that they can call home. And I hope that through what we've learned in this report this year and the focus of it, that we'd look at what Rachel has written, but also this report on the nation status of the nation housing. So excellent report, great opportunity to make an impact.
Thank you, Clarence. And I just want to echo your long-term view. I mean, I think when you think about gentrification, one of the challenges is whenever you're in the midst of it, housing has already become really expensive, which means the solutions are really expensive. And the solutions basically come back down to making sure there's housing that's affordable for the broad range of folks who've lived in that community, going back years. So what do we have to do? We got to build more permanently affordable housing that will be there over time. We have to build more opportunities for homeownership so people who live in that community benefit from that revitalization. So we have to have a long-term view, because if we could start now, well before gentrification happens, and have that long-term affordable rental, long-term homeownership, then as those communities revitalize, that benefits the community. So, think about gentrification, not just in the places that gentrify now, but think about it in Detroit, in Baltimore, in Cleveland. Pick your favorite place that we ought to be investing in now, and hopefully we'll have this problem of making sure we maintain affordability going forward.
And I think the inclusionary zoning process does that, because the properties cannot be flipped in a way after 5 years or so into another type of development. So I really feel strongly about making sure that that type of technique is used to create wealth for the community as well.
Gary, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are all great points. First of all, let me just give my kudos to Chris and the team for putting together a tremendous report once again. It serves as a benchmark to all of us in the industry, and it continues to be an incredible resource. So thank you for that. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and there's no silver bullets, unfortunately. But I think that there are a lot of areas where we can all improve, and better collaboration, I think, is one of the keys.
Thank you. Erica, I want to take an audience question from Twitter, and this is something I did not know about. They're saying that HUD reporting shows its housing choice voucher program is not widely used to support homeownership. Since 2015, the average number of housing choice vouchers annually used for homeownership has been 13,633, according to this person on Twitter, while growth remains flat. Are there any state or local governments experimenting with locally funded home mortgage voucher programs to promote home ownership and increase its accessibility to lower income households?
Thank you for that question. Though, this is not an area of deep expertise, but let me just point to work that I know Denver did. I don't know if Denver is still operating this program, but Denver had a very successful and a well-evaluated program. And Chris, I can maybe phone a friend here, but I believe it was George Galster's evaluation of the homeownership, the Section 8 homeownership voucher program that did have very positive results. I do think it is a choice that housing authorities can make as to whether they want to utilize housing vouchers to support homeownership programs. And so some housing authorities do use vouchers in that way. And I do think it's probably benchmarked on also the affordability of housing of homeownership opportunities in the community, whether the voucher makes sense to use in that way. But I would point to the research and evidence on the Denver program as probably one of the best designed efforts. Chris, help me out here. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did. As best I know too. And George has certainly done work there. My sense of this is that we to think about the spectrum of housing needs and where people are. And homeownership does come with some financial demands and risks. And so I would be concerned about thinking about people going straight from a Section 8 housing choice voucher to homeownership, because people receiving vouchers, this is the way our housing subsidy system works, are generally very low income. And so we're talking about people making $25,000, $20,000 a year or less. And so to go straight from there to home ownership is a big jump, and not in a place like Denver, thinking about what housing prices are now, you're not going to have much savings. You're not going to have much wherewithal to deal with anything that comes up. So I think we want to get people stably and securely housed. And I think that we should think about what's appropriate for people in different stages. I would point to in the voucher program, the opportunity for things like family self-sufficiency, which is a way for people who have, as their income rises, rather than having their increased share of income going towards rent, it goes into an escrow account, and you can start to save for things like home ownership or education or other things that you might need. And so I think we ought to be thinking about how we use the voucher program as a platform to help people advance. Home ownership may be one piece of it, but it may not be the most important piece for the people who are mostly in the voucher program. And I know, Erica, if you would disagree with that.
Yeah, I think sustainable homeownership is definitely something we are absolutely concerned about. And I would just maybe pivot the question to why it's so important and why the administration is focused so much on sustaining the people who are in mortgage forbearance now and finding an opportunity for them to keep their homes, because that too is a preservation of equity and wealth for many communities of color. And so we know in the last crisis that and I think your research points this out, Chris, that communities of color lost a great deal of wealth due to the loss of home ownership. We do not want to let that happen again. So we are going to work hard to support and sustain as much as we can folks who have faced a crisis and may not have as much income as they had at the beginning of the crisis, to try to still sustain and keep the wealth that they built and not lose ground and closing the very large racial wealth gap that we have.
Thank you, Erica. We will end on that note. There is so much to dig into here, and we could easily keep talking for hours, but we will leave it here. And of course, the full report is available on the Joint Center for Housing Studies website, along with a ton of data and interactive maps and tools. Thank you again to Chris, Dan, and our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.